Welcome back to Sigil Sanctum, where we journey into the shadows of history to uncover the most terrifying mysteries that time has tried to bury. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most spine-chilling tales ever done. The story of a grimoire, so cursed, so inherently evil, that it has left an unbroken trail of madness, death, and supernatural horror across more than 17 centuries of human history. What you're about to hear isn't just another ghost story or urban legend. This is a meticulously documented case that has been investigated by historians, theologians, paranormal researchers, and even government agencies. The evidence we'll explore today comes from church records, personal journals, official police reports, and eyewitness testimonies that span from the Roman Empire to the digital age. Our story begins in the year 304 AD, during the final years of the Roman persecution of Christians under Emperor in the bustling ancient city of Antioch, located in what is now modern-day Turkey, lived a man whose name would become synonymous with forbidden knowledge and supernatural terror. This man was Cyprian of Antioch, though history would later know him by a far more ominous title, Saint Cyprian, the sorcerer. But Cyprian wasn't always a saint. In fact, his early life was devoted to the darkest aspects of the occult arts. Born into a wealthy family of merchants, Cyprian showed an unusual intelligence from childhood. By the age of 7, he could read and write in 5 languages. By 14, he had memorized vast portions of the most ancient texts in his father's extensive library. But it wasn't knowledge of commerce or philosophy that captivated young Cyprian. It was the forbidden texts hidden in the deepest vaults of his family's collection. These weren't ordinary books of magic or simple spell collections. Cyprian's family had, over generations, acquired some of the most dangerous occult materials ever created. Tablets inscribed with Sumerian incantations that predated recorded history. Egyptian papyri that supposedly contained the actual words spoken by the priests of Set during their most blasphemous rituals. Greek manuscripts that claimed to record conversations with entities that existed before the creation of the physical universe. By the time Cyprian reached adulthood, he had become the most feared and respected sorcerer in the Eastern Roman Empire. His reputation extended far beyond simple magic tricks or fortune-telling. Cyprian was said to command legions of demons, to have visited the underworld and returned with secrets that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. Emperors consulted him in secret. Rival sorcerers feared to speak his name aloud. Even the early Christians, despite their faith, would cross themselves and whisper protective prayers when his name was mentioned. But Cyprian's greatest work and humanity's greatest curse began in the winter of 304 AD, according to his own writings. Discovered centuries later in a sealed chamber beneath what is now Istanbul, Cyprian had grown dissatisfied with the limitations of conventional magic. He sought something more: absolute power over reality itself. Not just the ability to influence events or command spirits, but the power to rewrite the fundamental laws that governed existence. By the way, before we continue with this absolutely terrifying tale, I'm curious, wherever you are in the world right now, watching or listening to this, drop a comment and let us know which country you're tuning in from. We have Sigil Sanctum viewers from every continent, and it's always fascinating to see how these ancient mysteries resonate across different cultures and continents. Are you watching from the bustling streets of Tokyo, the historic cities of Europe, the vast landscapes of Australia, or maybe you're somewhere completely unexpected? Let us know. We love connecting with our global community of mystery seekers. Now, returning to our story. The creation of what would become known as the Saint Cyprian grimoire wasn't a simple matter of writing down spells and rituals. According to Cyprian's own accounts, the process required him to make contact with entities that existed outside of normal space and time, beings that had witnessed the birth and death of universes, creatures whose very existence defied every natural law. The ritual to contact these entities took place over 7 consecutive nights during the winter solstice. Cyprian had prepared for months, gathering materials that included rare minerals from meteorites, waters from springs that had never seen sunlight, and most disturbingly organic components from individuals who had died under very specific circumstances. The exact nature of these materials is too disturbing to detail fully, but church records suggest they involved the willing sacrifice of several of Cyprian's most devoted followers. On the first night, Cyprian used a combination of ancient Chaldean invocations and geometric patterns carved directly into the stone floor of his underground chamber. These weren't simple protective circles or summoning diagrams. They were 3-dimensional mathematical structures that seemed to bend space itself. Witnesses reported that the chamber appeared to become larger on the inside than the outside, with corridors and passages that led to places that couldn't possibly exist within the building's physical structure. As the nights progressed, the entities began to respond. Cyprian's journals described them not as demons or spirits in any traditional sense, but as fragments of a cosmic intelligence, so vast and alien that human language couldn't adequately describe them. They communicated through methods that bypassed normal sensory perception. Information was simply inserted directly into Cyprian's consciousness. often accompanied by visions of realities that operated by completely different physical laws. These entities revealed to Cyprian that what humans perceived as reality was actually just one thin layer of a vastly more complex, multidimensional structure. They showed him how to access these other layers, how to manipulate the underlying code that determined everything from the behavior of subatomic particles to the movement of galaxies. But most importantly, they taught him how to record this knowledge in a form that could be preserved and passed on, though they warned him that the knowledge itself was so dangerous that it would inevitably corrupt and destroy anyone who attempted to use it. The resulting grimoire was unlike anything that had ever existed before. The pages weren't made from ordinary parchment or papyrus, but from a material that seemed to exist in a state between solid and liquid. The text wasn't written with conventional ink, but with substances that appeared to move and shift when observed directly. Most unsettling of all, the words themselves seemed to possess a form of intelligence. Readers reported that the text would adapt itself to their level of understanding, revealing deeper layers of meaning the more they studied it. The language used in the grimoire was a mixture of ancient Latin, Aramaic, and symbol systems that appeared to predate human civilization entirely. Some scholars who have studied fragments of the text believe these symbols represent a form of mathematical notation that describes the fundamental structure of reality itself, a kind of programming language for the universe. But the most terrifying aspect of the grimoire wasn't its content, it was its apparent ability to exist independently of normal physical laws. From the moment of its creation, the book demonstrated properties that defied rational explanation. It could appear and disappear at will, seemed to be unaffected by fire or water, and showed signs of actually influencing events in the physical world, even when no one was actively reading from it. Cyprian himself realized almost immediately that he had created something far beyond his ability to control. His final journal entries, written just days before his conversion to Christianity, speak of overwhelming regret and a desperate desire to undo what he had done. He describes the grimoire as a wound in the fabric of creation itself and a door that should never have been opened. The transformation of Cyprian from the most feared sorcerer in the Roman Empire to a devout Christian saint happened virtually overnight. Church historians record that he appeared at the gates of the Christian community in Antioch, begging for baptism and protection from the forces he had unleashed. His conversion was so sudden and complete that many suspected it was some kind of elaborate deception. However, Cyprian's subsequent actions, including his willingness to face martyrdom rather than renounce his new faith, convinced even the most skeptical Christians that his transformation was genuine. But converting to Christianity didn't solve the problem of the grimoire. If anything, Cyprian's abandonment of the dark arts seemed to make the book even more active and malevolent. Reports began to surface of the grimoire appearing in the homes of Cyprian's former associates, inevitably bringing madness and death. The book seemed to be seeking new hosts, new minds to corrupt with its forbidden knowledge. Cyprian spent his final years desperately trying to find a way to destroy or contain the grimoire, but every attempt failed. Fire wouldn't burn it, acid wouldn't dissolve it. Burial and consecrated ground only resulted in the book reappearing elsewhere, often accompanied by the desecration of nearby graves. Even direct divine intervention seemed powerless against it. Cyprian reported that during one exorcism attempt, the book actually laughed, producing sounds that came from no human throat. The execution of Saint Cyprian in 304 AD marked the end of his personal struggle with the grimoire, but it was only the beginning of the book's reign of terror. With its creator dead, and no longer able to impose even minimal control over it, the grimoire was free to pursue its own agenda, an agenda that would bring horror to every corner of the world for centuries to come. What that agenda might be remains one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire case. The evidence suggests that the grimoire isn't simply a collection of dangerous knowledge. It appears to be actively working towards some larger goal, systematically seeking out individuals who possess the intelligence and ambition necessary to advance its mysterious purpose. Each new victim becomes not just another casualty, but another step in a plan that spans centuries and continues to unfold even today. Before we dive deeper into the centuries of terror that followed Saint Cyprian's death, I want to take a moment to address our incredible Sigil Sanctum community. If you're finding this investigation as fascinating and terrifying as I am, and if you want to make sure you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest mysteries, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Trust me, what we have coming up on this channel will challenge everything you think you know about the boundaries between history and horror. We've got investigations into cursed artifacts, haunted locations, and supernatural phenomena that will keep you questioning reality long after the videos end. And don't forget to share this with fellow mystery enthusiasts, but maybe warn them to watch during daylight hours. Some of our viewers have reported having unusually vivid nightmares after watching our content late at night. Whether that's just coincidence or something more, well, that's for you to decide now. Let's return to the immediate aftermath of Saint Cyprian's execution and the beginning of the grimoire's independent reign of terror. The first documented victim of the uncontrolled grimoire was Marcus Aurelius Corvus, a wealthy Roman merchant who had been one of Cyprian's most frequent clients before the sorcerer's conversion. Corvus had built his fortune through what his competitors considered impossibly good luck. His ships never sank. His caravans were never attacked by bandits, and he always seemed to know exactly which goods would be in highest demand in distant markets. What Corvus's rivals didn't know was that his success came from a long-standing arrangement with Cyprian, in exchange for substantial payments and certain favors that are too disturbing to detail here. Cyprian had provided Corvus with magical protections and supernatural insights into future market conditions. When news of Cyprian's conversion and execution reached Corvus in early 340 AD, the merchant was faced with a crisis. His supernatural advantages were gone, and his business empire was built on foundations that wouldn't survive without magical support. Desperate to maintain his wealth and status, Corvus began seeking other sources of occult assistance. He contacted sorcerers throughout the Mediterranean, offering enormous sums for protections and blessings comparable to what Cyprian had provided. However, none of the practitioners he consulted were willing to work with him. Word had spread throughout the occult community about Cyprian's dramatic conversion and warnings about the dangerous forces he had been dealing with. Even the most ambitious and ruthless sorcerers were afraid to involve themselves with anything connected to Cyprian's former practice. It was during this period of desperate searching that the grimoire first made its presence known to Corvus. According to his personal journal discovered during excavations of his villa in 1892, the book simply appeared in his private study one evening, sitting on his desk as if it had always been there. Corvus initially thought one of his servants had brought it, but when questioned, none of them had any memory of seeing the book before. The merchant's journal entries from this period reveal a man slowly succumbing to an obsession that would ultimately destroy him. He describes the grimoire as more beautiful and terrible than anything I have ever seen, with pages that seemed to glow with their own inner light, and text that appeared to rearrange itself based on his thoughts and questions. Unlike other occult texts he had encountered, which required extensive study and practice to yield useful results, the grimoire seemed eager to share its secrets. The first rituals Corvus performed were relatively minor, simple protections for his business ventures and divination spells to predict market fluctuations. The results were immediately and dramatically successful. His ships began arriving ahead of schedule with more valuable cargo than expected. His land-based trade routes became impossibly profitable. Competitors who had been gaining ground suddenly found their own ventures failing in spectacular fashion, but success came with a price that Corvus initially failed to recognize. His journal entries begin to show subtle changes in his handwriting and language patterns within just weeks of acquiring the grimoire. Words appear in scripts he claimed not to recognize, though the meaning was somehow clear to him. Mathematical formulas that shouldn't have been known to ancient mathematicians for another 1,000 years began appearing in the margins of his business correspondence. More disturbing were the changes in Corvus himself. His household staff reported that he began speaking to invisible companions during his private studies. His sleep became increasingly erratic, with servants hearing him pacing his chambers at all hours, muttering in languages that sounded ancient and alien. His appetite for normal food diminished, but he developed cravings for substances that shouldn't have been considered edible: raw metals, certain types of stone, and organic materials that his servants refused to identify in their testimonies. The supernatural phenomena affecting Corvus's household escalated rapidly. Mirrors throughout the villa began showing reflections that didn't match. Reality rooms appeared larger or smaller than they actually were. Doorways led to corridors that shouldn't have existed, and family portraits displayed faces of people no one could identify. The villa's extensive gardens, once Corvus's pride and joy, withered despite optimal growing conditions. Even more unsettling, new plants began growing, species that local botanists couldn't classify, with flowers that bloomed only at night and emitted sounds that resembled distant screaming. Corvus's business associates began avoiding him after a series of increasingly bizarre meetings. He would arrive for negotiations, speaking fluently in ancient languages, presenting contracts written in scripts that looked like a mixture of Latin and geometric symbols. When asked to explain these documents, Corvus would become agitated and insist that the terms were perfectly clear to anyone with eyes to see. Several of his former partners reported experiencing vivid nightmares after these encounters: streams of vast underground cities and towering structures that seemed to exist in defiance of geometry and physics. The climax of Corvus's descent into madness occurred during a dinner party he hosted for Antioch's most prominent citizens in the spring of 341 AD. Multiple eyewitness accounts describe an evening that began normally but gradually descended into something that resembled a scene from the deepest levels of hell. The dinner conversation, initially focused on typical business and social matters, slowly shifted to topics that made the guests increasingly uncomfortable: discussions of ancient civilizations that had supposedly preceded humanity, philosophical questions about the nature of reality that seemed to have no satisfactory answers, and historical events that none of the educated guests could recall from their studies. As the evening progressed, The dinner guests began to notice that the villa itself seemed to be changing around them. Hallways they had walked through earlier appeared to lead to different rooms. Windows showed views of landscapes that couldn't possibly be visible from the villa's actual location. Most disturbing of all, additional guests seemed to be joining the dinner party, individuals in ancient clothing who spoke in archaic dialects and claimed to be friends of Corvus from the old times. The evening reached its horrifying climax. When Corvus began reading aloud from the grimoire, eyewitness accounts described texts that seemed to writhe and move on the pages, words that hurt to hear and caused several guests to experience spontaneous nosebleeds. The villa's temperature dropped so dramatically that water froze in the guests' cups, while simultaneously, several of the dinner guests reported feeling as if they were burning from the inside. The surviving guests fled the villa in panic, but not before witnessing something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they escaped, they looked back to see Corvus standing in the villa's main courtyard, arms raised toward the sky, while shadows that seemed to possess independent movement swirled around him. The shadows gradually took on humanoid forms, impossibly thin figures that appeared to be leading Corvus in some kind of ritual dance. When Roman authorities investigated the villa the following morning, they found a scene that defied explanation. Corvus and his entire household, 17 people in total, were discovered dead, arranged in a perfect spiral pattern in the main courtyard. Their bodies showed no signs of violence or disease, but their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror mixed with what investigators described as inappropriate ecstasy. Most disturbing of all, their bodies had been drained of blood, but no blood was found anywhere on the property. The grimoire itself was nowhere to be found, though investigators reported discovering strange symbols burned into the stone floor of Corvus's study, symbols that seemed to move and shift when observed directly. Several of the investigating officers later reported experiencing severe psychological disturbances, including shared nightmares that featured the same tall, thin figures that the dinner party survivors had described. The Corvus incident established a pattern that would repeat throughout the grimoire's history. The book would appear to individuals who possessed both the penetmunel intelligence to understand its contents and the ambition to attempt using its power. It would provide immediate, dramatic results that seemed to validate the user's decision to engage with it. But this initial success was always followed by a rapid psychological deterioration that culminated in the death of the user and everyone in their immediate vicinity. What made the grimoire particularly insidious was its apparent ability to adapt its approach to each new victim. Corvus had been motivated by greed and social status, so the book provided wealth and influence. Future victims would find that the grimoire somehow knew exactly what they desired most, and would offer a path to achieve it, always with the same ultimately fatal results. During the centuries following the Corvus incident, reports of similar tragedies began appearing throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. An Egyptian priest named Kente found the grimoire in a tomb near Alexandria and used it to attempt communication with ancient gods, resulting in the complete destruction of his temple and the mysterious disappearance of everyone who had been present during his final ritual. A Celtic druid named Brenos discovered the book in a sacred grove in what is now France and used it to try to protect his people from Roman invasion. The entire tribe was found dead 3 days later, arranged in complex geometric patterns that seemed to serve some unknown purpose. Each incident shared common elements: the sudden appearance of the grimoire in the possession of someone with both arcane knowledge and desperate motivations, initial success that exceeded all expectations, rapid psychological deterioration, and ultimately, death accompanied by supernatural phenomena that defied rational explanation. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that each tragedy seemed to serve some larger purpose. The victims weren't random casualties, but appeared to have been specifically selected to advance some cosmic agenda that remained hidden from human understanding. By the end of the 8th century, the grimoire had acquired a reputation throughout the known world. It was mentioned in the secret records of the early Catholic Church, referenced in Islamic texts on forbidden knowledge, and feared by pagan practitioners who normally showed no hesitation in dealing with dangerous supernatural forces. The book had become more than just a cursed artifact. It was recognized as an active agent of some malevolent intelligence that was systematically working to corrupt and destroy human civilization. Yet despite centuries of warnings and documented tragedies, the grimoire continued to find new victims. Its ability to offer exactly what each person most desperately desired proved irresistible to those who believed they could succeed where others had failed. Each new victim was convinced that they possessed either the knowledge or the willpower necessary to control the book's power, and each new victim ultimately learned that the grimoire's true power lay not in granting wishes, but in revealing the terrible price of forbidden knowledge. The medieval period marked a significant evolution in both the grimoire's influence and humanity's understanding of the supernatural threat it represented. As Christianity spread throughout Europe and the Catholic Church consolidated its power, A new category of individuals began encountering the cursed tomes: scholars, monks, and theologians who possessed both the intellectual capacity to engage with its contents and access to the extensive libraries and resources necessary for serious occult research. The Church's response to reports of the grimoire was initially skeptical, but became increasingly concerned as evidence accumulated. Pope Gregory VII established a secret department within the Vatican in 1084, specifically tasked with investigating reports of supernatural phenomena that posed threats to Christian souls. This department, known internally as the Congregatio di Investigatione Mysterium Congregation for the Investigation of Mysteries, maintained detailed records of grimoire encounters that provide some of our most reliable historical documentation of the book's activities during this period. One of the most extensively documented cases occurred at the monastery of San Miguel de Escalada in northern Spain in 892 AD. Founded in 881, had quickly become renowned throughout Iberia for its extensive scriptorium and library, which contained one of the largest collections of religious and philosophical texts in medieval Europe. The monks of San Miguel were particularly known for their work in preserving and copying ancient manuscripts, including many texts that dealt with theological questions about the nature of evil and divine justice. Brother Isidoro, head librarian and most accomplished scholar, first discovered the grimoire on a cold October morning in 892. According to his detailed journal, one of the most valuable primary sources we have for this period, he had arrived at the library before dawn to continue his work on a treatise concerning the theological implications of certain apocryphal texts. As he entered the main reading chamber, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. A book lay open on the central reading table, despite Isidoro's certain knowledge that he had secured all materials before leaving the previous evening. The book itself was unlike anything in the monastery's collection, bound in what appeared to be black leather that had an unusual warmth to the touch, with pages that seemed to emit a faint luminescence in the pre-dawn darkness. Most unsettling of all, the text appeared to be written in a script that Isidoro initially couldn't identify, yet somehow he found that he could understand its meaning without conscious effort. Isidoro's first journal entries regarding the grimoire show a scholar's natural curiosity overcoming his religious caution. He describes attempting to classify the book's language and script, noting similarities to Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, but also identifying symbols and grammatical structures that didn't match any known ancient language. His linguistic analysis revealed something that should have served as a warning. The text seemed to adapt itself to his level of understanding, revealing deeper layers of meaning the more he studied it. What began as scholarly investigation quickly evolved into obsession. Isidoro found himself spending entire days and nights studying the grimoire, neglecting his other duties and avoiding contact with his fellow monks. His journal entries from this period show a gradual but unmistakable deterioration in his mental state. His handwriting becomes increasingly erratic, with words and phrases appearing in scripts he claimed not to recognize. Mathematical formulas begin appearing in the margins, calculations that seem to deal with astronomical phenomena, but using numerical systems that wouldn't be developed by European mathematicians for several more centuries. The other monks at San Miguel began to notice disturbing changes in their colleagues' behavior. Brother Teodoro, Isidoro's closest friend and collaborator, reported that Isidoro had begun speaking to invisible companions during his studies. When approached, Isidoro would claim to be consulting with the ancient authorities and would become agitated when pressed for clarification. His sleep patterns became increasingly erratic. Other monks reported seeing him wandering the monastery corridors at all hours, carrying the grimoire and muttering in languages that sounded ancient and otherworldly. Perhaps most disturbing were the changes that began affecting the monastery itself. The library's other books began showing signs of deterioration despite being stored in optimal conditions. Manuscripts that had been perfectly preserved for decades suddenly developed stains that appeared to move and spread across the pages. Religious texts began displaying additional text that appeared overnight, marginalia written in the same mysterious script as the grimoire, often containing commentaries that contradicted or mocked the original religious content. The monastery's chapel became the site of increasingly strange phenomena. During evening prayers, monks reported hearing additional voices, joining their chants, voices that seemed to come from beneath the floor or within the walls themselves. The voices sang in harmonies that were mathematically perfect but emotionally disturbing, creating sounds that were beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. Several monks reported experiencing spontaneous visions during prayer, images of vast underground cities, impossible architectural structures, and beings that appeared to be human but possessed too many limbs or facial features arranged in configurations that hurt to perceive directly. Brother Isidoro's final journal entries, written in a mixture of Latin and the mysterious script from the grimoire, provide a chilling glimpse into the final stages of his psychological deterioration. He writes of conversations with the builders of the first cities and instruction from those who shaped the deep places before the world learned to forget. His descriptions of the grimoire's contents become increasingly incomprehensible. filled with references to mathematical concepts that wouldn't be discovered until the modern era, and philosophical ideas that seemed to question the fundamental nature of reality itself. The crisis at San Miguel reached its climax during the winter solstice of 892. Brother Teodoro's account, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, describes 3 nights of escalating supernatural phenomena that culminated in a tragedy that would haunt the church for centuries. On the first night, the monks gathering for midnight prayers found the chapel filled with an unnatural fog that seemed to emanate from the altar itself. The fog carried sounds, whispers in ancient languages, distant music that followed no recognizable patterns, and what several monks described as the sound of massive machinery operating somewhere beneath the monastery. On the second night, the monastery's architecture itself began to change. Corridors that had led to familiar rooms suddenly opened onto chambers that shouldn't have existed within the building structure. The library expanded beyond its physical boundaries, with shelves of books stretching into darkness that seemed to have no end. Most disturbing of all, some of these additional books appeared to be written by the monks themselves, future works that described events and discoveries that hadn't yet occurred. The third night brought the final catastrophe. Brother Teodoro, along with several other monks, discovered Isidoro in the library, surrounded by dozens of open books, all displaying the same mysterious script as the grimoire. Isidoro himself appeared to have aged decades in a matter of weeks, his hair completely white, and his eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed distinctly inhuman. He was speaking continuously in the ancient language, but his words were being simultaneously translated into Latin by invisible voices that filled the air around him. What Teodoro witnessed next would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The air in the library began to shimmer and twist, revealing glimpses of what appeared to be another reality occupying the same space. In this alternate version of the library, tall figures in flowing robes moved between the shelves, selecting books and making notes in scripts that hurt to look at directly. These figures occasionally turned to observe the terrified monks, acknowledging their presence with nods that suggested vast alien intelligence. Isidoro's final transformation occurred as the bells tolled midnight. According to Teodoro's account, his friend simply unfolded. There's no better way to describe it. Isidoro's physical form seemed to reveal additional dimensions that had always been present, but hidden from normal perception. The monks found themselves looking at something that was still recognizably their colleague, but also something infinitely more complex and frightening. When dawn broke on the winter solstice, the supernatural phenomena ceased as suddenly as they had begun. The library returned to its normal dimensions, the additional books disappeared, and the mysterious fog dissipated. But Brother Isidoro was gone, leaving behind only his journal and a set of footprints burned into the stone floor that led from his reading table to a solid wall where they simply stopped. The grimoire itself had also vanished, though its influence on the monastery continued for years afterward. Several monks reported ongoing psychological disturbances, including shared dreams that featured the same tall-robed figures Teodoro had witnessed. The monastery's library never fully recovered. Books continued to show signs of spontaneous deterioration, and scholarly work became increasingly difficult as monks found themselves distracted by whispers and visions that seemed to emanate from the texts themselves. The Church's investigation of the San Miguel incident, led by a special commission appointed by Pope Formosus, concluded that the monastery had been infiltrated by what they termed intelligences that preceded the creation of the material world. Their report, classified at the highest levels of church hierarchy, recommended that any future encounters with the grimoire should be handled exclusively by specially trained exorcists who had undergone extensive preparation for dealing with entities that operate outside the normal boundaries of divine and infernal influence. This recommendation would prove prophetic, as the grimoire's medieval appearances became increasingly frequent and deadly. The book seemed drawn to centers of learning and religious devotion, appearing in monasteries, cathedral schools, and early universities throughout Europe. Each appearance followed a similar pattern. An accomplished scholar would discover the book, become obsessed with its contents, experience a rapid psychological deterioration, and ultimately disappear or die under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Notable cases from this period include the incident at the Abbey of Cluny in 981, where Brother Odalbert's study of the grimoire resulted in the temporary transformation of the Abbey scriptorium into what witnesses described as a library that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. The University of Paris case in 1277, where Professor Guillaume de Morbic's encounter with the grimoire led to the discovery of mathematical proofs that wouldn't be formally developed until the Renaissance. And the terrifying events at Canterbury Cathedral in 1349, where Archbishop Thomas Bradwardin's final sermon, delivered after weeks of studying the grimoire, reportedly caused several members of the congregation to speak in languages that linguistic scholars were unable to classify. Each incident added to the Church's growing understanding that the grimoire represented something far more dangerous than a simple collection of forbidden spells or demonic invocations. The evidence suggested that the book was actively working to corrupt human knowledge itself, systematically seeking out the brightest minds of each generation and using them to advance some cosmic agenda that remained hidden from human understanding. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the grimoire's medieval activities was the gradual realization that its influence wasn't limited to direct contact. Libraries that had housed the book, even briefly, continued to experience supernatural phenomena long after its departure. Scholars who had merely been in the presence of someone studying the grimoire reported experiencing enhanced intellectual capabilities accompanied by disturbing psychological changes. It seemed that the book's influence could spread like a contagion, affecting entire intellectual communities and potentially altering the course of human knowledge development in ways that were subtle but profound. But by the end of the medieval period, the grimoire had earned a reputation throughout Christendom as the most dangerous supernatural artifact in existence. Secret church documents from this era refer to it as the book that teaches what should not be learned, and the text that reveals the price of all knowledge. Yet despite centuries of warnings and documented tragedies, the grimoire continued to find new victim scholars and theologians who believed that their faith, their intelligence, or their pure intentions would protect them from the fate that had befallen their predecessors. This pattern of intellectual hubris leading to supernatural tragedy would continue into the Renaissance and beyond, as the grimoire adapted its methods to each new era of human development, always finding ways to exploit humanity's greatest strength, our insatiable curiosity about the nature of reality itself. The Renaissance period brought about a fundamental shift in how European intellectuals approached the study of the supernatural. As classical learning was rediscovered and new scientific methods developed, many scholars began to view medieval accounts of supernatural phenomena with skepticism, dismissing them as products of religious superstition and ignorance. This rationalist attitude would prove tragically misguided when applied to the Saint Cyprian grimoire, as several of the era's most brilliant minds would discover to their eternal cost. The incident at the monastery of Santa Maria de Arment, in Galicia, Spain, in 1580, represents one of the most thoroughly documented encounters with the grimoire during this period. Unlike many previous cases, this incident was investigated not only by church authorities but also by representatives of the Spanish Inquisition and scholars from the University of Salamanca, providing us with multiple independent accounts of the same terrifying events. Brother Bernardo de Castilla, a Franciscan monk stationed at Armentera, was widely regarded as one of the most learned men in Spain. Fluent in 7 languages, including ancient Greek and Hebrew, he had earned recognition throughout Europe for his commentaries on patristic theology and his translations of previously unknown manuscripts discovered in the monastery's extensive archives. Brother Bernardo represented the new Renaissance ideal of the scholar priest, a man who combined deep religious faith with rigorous intellectual methodology and an appreciation for the knowledge of classical antiquity. The Armentera monastery, founded in the 12th century, had been built upon the ruins of a much older structure, possibly a Roman temple, though local legends claimed it had been a Celtic sacred site before the Roman conquest. During renovation work in 1579, workers had discovered a network of underground chambers that appeared to predate the monastery's construction by many centuries. Brother Bernardo had been tasked with cataloging any manuscripts or artifacts found in these ancient chambers, work that required him to spend long hours in the cold, dimly lit underground passages. According to Brother Bernardo's journal, he first encountered the grimoire in a chamber that had been sealed behind a wall decorated with symbols that appeared to be neither Roman nor Celtic. The chamber itself was architecturally puzzling, its dimensions seemed wrong, with angles that didn't quite add up to the geometric totals they should have produced. More unsettling, the chamber appeared to be larger on the inside than the outside. Dimensions could account for a phenomenon that Brother Bernardo initially attributed to optical illusion, but gradually came to recognize as genuinely impossible. The grimoire lay on a stone altar in the center of the chamber, surrounded by objects that Brother Bernardo couldn't immediately classify. Some appeared to be scientific instruments, but constructed according to principles that didn't match any known ancient technology. Others resembled religious artifacts, but incorporated symbols and geometries that didn't correspond to any known religious tradition. Most disturbing were items that seemed to be organic in nature but preserved in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Flowers that maintained their color and flexibility despite obvious antiquity, and what appeared to be anatomical specimens from creatures that didn't match any known species. Brother Bernardo's initial approach to the grimoire reflected the Renaissance confidence in rational analysis and systematic investigation. Unlike medieval monks who might have immediately recognized the book as a supernatural threat, Brother Bernardo saw it as an intellectual challenge, a manuscript that could potentially advance human understanding through careful study and translation. His journal entries from the first weeks of study show the methodical approach of a trained scholar. He documented the book's physical properties, the unusual warmth of its binding, the luminescent quality of its pages, and the way the text seemed to shift based on lighting conditions. He attempted to classify its language, noting similarities to Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, but also identifying grammatical structures that didn't match any known ancient language family. What Brother Bernardo failed to recognize initially was that the grimoire was studying him as much as he was studying it. The book's text began adapting to his specific areas of expertise, revealing passages that directly addressed his theological questions and offering solutions to philosophical problems he had been wrestling with for years. When he struggled with a particular translation, alternative interpretations would appear in the margins, written in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of making such notes. The monk's colleagues at Armentera began noticing subtle changes in Brother Bernardo's behavior within the first month of his underground studies. Father Superior Rodrigo noted in his own journal that Bernardo had begun incorporating unusual references into his sermons, mentions of ancient civilizations that predated biblical chronology and philosophical concepts that seemed to question fundamental Catholic doctrine. When questioned about these references, Bernardo would claim they came from recently discovered patristic sources, but could never provide specific citations. More concerning were the physical changes affecting Brother Bernardo. He began losing weight rapidly despite maintaining his normal eating habits. His sleep became increasingly erratic, with other monks reporting that they could hear him pacing his cell at all hours. Speaking in languages that sounded ancient but unfamiliar, most unsettling, his eyes began to reflect light and darkness, a phenomenon that several monks witnessed, but that Bernardo himself seemed unaware of. The supernatural phenomena affecting the monastery escalated gradually but inexorably. The extensive library began experiencing mysterious problems. Books would be found open to pages that contradicted their known contents. Manuscripts would display additional text that appeared overnight, and several volumes began emitting sounds that resembled distant whispers. The monastery's gardens, traditionally maintained as a source of both food and spiritual contemplation, began producing plants that local botanists couldn't identify. These new species grew with unnatural speed and vigor, often displaying flower patterns that seemed to form complex geometric designs when viewed from above. Perhaps most disturbing were the changes affecting the monastery's chapel. During evening prayers, monks began reporting additional voices, joining their chants, voices that seemed to come from beneath the floor or within the stone walls themselves. The voices sang in perfect harmony, but in languages that hurt to listen to for extended periods. Several monks experienced spontaneous visions during prayer, seeing images of vast underground cities populated by tall figures in flowing robes who moved with an intelligence that seemed distinctly non-human. Brother Bernardo's journal entries from this period reveal a man struggling to maintain his sanity while being exposed to knowledge that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. He writes of conversations with the architects of the first cities, and instruction from those who walked between the stars before the earth learned to spin. His descriptions of the grimoire's contents become increasingly incomprehensible, filled with references to mathematical concepts that wouldn't be developed until the modern era, and cosmological theories that seem to question the structure of reality itself. The crisis at Armentera reached its climax during Holy Week of 1581. Father Superior Rodrigo's detailed account, preserved in the archives of the Spanish Inquisition, describes 7 days of escalating supernatural phenomena that culminated in a tragedy that would influence church policy regarding occult investigations for centuries to come. On Palm Sunday, the monks gathering for morning prayers found the chapel filled with an unnatural fog that seemed to emanate from the altar itself. The fog carried sounds, whispers in ancient languages, distant music that followed no recognizable harmonic patterns, and what several monks described as the sound of vast machinery operating somewhere beneath the monastery foundations. When the fog finally dissipated, the monks discovered that the chapel's religious artwork had been altered overnight. Paintings of biblical scenes now included additional figures in the background, tall, robed entities that seemed to be observing the traditional religious narratives with expressions that suggested vast alien amusement. On Monday and Tuesday of Holy Week, the monastery's architecture itself began to exhibit impossible properties. Corridors that had led to familiar rooms suddenly opened onto chambers that shouldn't have existed within the building's physical structure. The library expanded beyond its architectural boundaries, with shelves of books stretching into darkness that seemed to have no end. Most disturbing, some of these additional books appeared to be written by the monks themselves, future works that described events and discoveries that hadn't yet occurred, including detailed accounts of their own deaths. Wednesday brought the discovery that the underground chamber where Brother Bernardo conducted his studies had become significantly larger than its external dimensions could account for. Investigation teams sent to measure the chamber reported that it appeared to connect to a network of tunnels and rooms that extended far beyond the monastery's boundaries. These additional spaces contained artifacts and inscriptions that suggested the presence of a civilization that had possessed technology and knowledge far beyond anything known to ancient peoples. Thursday's supernatural phenomena focused on Brother Bernardo himself. Fellow monks reported that he had begun to cast multiple shadows, despite single light sources, and that these shadows sometimes moved independently of his physical form. His voice began to carry harmonic overtones that made conversation with him deeply unsettling. Listeners would find themselves understanding concepts and ideas that they were certain they had never learned. Most terrifying, Bernardo began to display knowledge of events that hadn't yet occurred, including specific details about the personal lives and future deaths of his fellow monks. Good Friday brought the final catastrophe. Father Superior Rodrigo, along with several other monks, found Brother Bernardo in the underground chamber, surrounded by dozens of open books, all displaying the same mysterious script as the grimoire. Bernardo himself appeared to have aged decades in a matter of months. His hair completely white and his eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed distinctly inhuman. He was speaking continuously in the ancient language discovered in the grimoire, but his words were being simultaneously translated into Spanish by invisible voices that filled the air around him. What Father Rodrigo witnessed next would haunt him for the remainder of his life and would be documented in reports that reached the highest levels of the Spanish Inquisition and the Vatican. The air in the chamber began to shimmer and twist, revealing glimpses of what appeared to be another reality occupying the same space. In this alternate version of the chamber, tall figures in flowing robes moved between shelves of books, selecting volumes and making notes in scripts that hurt to observe directly. These figures occasionally turned to acknowledge the terrified monks, nodding with expressions that suggested vast ancient intelligence. Brother Bernardo's final transformation occurred as the church bells tolled the hour of Christ's death. According to Father Rodrigo's account, his colleagues simply expounded. His physical form seemed to reveal additional dimensions that had always been present but hidden from normal human perception. The monks found themselves looking at something that was still recognizably Brother Bernardo, but also something infinitely more complex and terrifying, a human mind that had been opened to realities that human consciousness wasn't designed to comprehend. When Easter Sunday dawned, the supernatural phenomena ceased as suddenly as they had begun. The chamber returned to its normal dimensions, the additional books disappeared, and the mysterious fog dissipated. But Brother Bernardo was gone, leaving behind only his journal and a set of footprints burned into the stone floor that led from his reading table to a solid wall where they simply vanished. The grimoire itself had also disappeared, though its influence on the monastery continued for years afterward. Several monks reported ongoing psychological disturbances, including shared dreams that featured the same tall, robed figures Father Rodrigo had witnessed. The monastery's library never fully recovered, books continued to show signs of spontaneous deterioration, and scholarly work became increasingly difficult as monks found themselves distracted by whispers and visions that seemed to emanate from the texts themselves. The Spanish Inquisition's investigation of the Armentera incident, led by a special commission that included both theologians and natural philosophers, concluded that the monastery had been infiltrated by what they termed intelligences that existed before the creation of the material world, and that seek to corrupt human knowledge for purposes that remain hidden from divine revelation. Their report, classified at the highest levels of both church and secular authority, recommended that any future encounters with similar artifacts should be handled exclusively by specially trained teams that combined religious authority with scholarly expertise. This recommendation would prove inadequate, as subsequent encounters with the grimoire demonstrated that no amount of preparation or expertise could protect against an artifact that seemed to operate by rules that superseded normal physical and spiritual laws. Following the Armentera incident, the grimoire seemed to disappear from documented history for nearly 3 centuries. This period of apparent dormancy has led some researchers to speculate that the book requires time to recharge between major manifestations, or that it deliberately seeks periods of obscurity to avoid attracting too much attention from authorities, who might develop effective countermeasures. However, private records and family histories from this period suggest that the grimoire didn't disappear entirely, but rather shifted its focus from public institutions to private collectors and individual scholars. Scattered references and personal correspondence, estate inventories, and auction records indicate that the book continued to circulate among wealthy collectors of occult materials, often changing hands after the mysterious deaths of its owners. This underground circulation would continue until 1872, when the grimoire re-emerged in one of the most extensively documented supernatural tragedies of the modern era, the destruction of the Ravenscroft family at their ancestral manor in the English countryside. Ravenscroft Manor, built in the early 1600s by Sir Edmund Ravenscroft, had been designed as both a family residence and a repository for one of England's most extensive private libraries. The Ravenscroft family had a long tradition of scholarship and collecting, with each generation adding to the estate's impressive collection of books, manuscripts, and artifacts from around the world. By the 1870s, the manor housed over 50,000 volumes, including many rare and unique texts that dealt with subjects ranging from ancient history to natural philosophy to, unfortunately, occult studies. Lord Edmund Ravenscroft VII, who inherited the estate in 1871, was a typical Victorian gentleman, scholar educated at Oxford, well-traveled, and possessed of the characteristic 19th-century confidence that rational investigation could ultimately explain any phenomena, no matter how mysterious. This confidence would prove tragically misplaced when applied to the supernatural forces that his family was about to encounter. The grimoire's arrival at Ravenscroft Manor was, like many of its previous appearances, both sudden and inexplicable. Lord Edmund's personal journal indicates that the book simply appeared in the manor's library one morning, in early 1872, sitting on a reading table as if it had always been there. None of the household staff could recall seeing it before, and the estate's detailed catalogue system showed no record of its acquisition. What distinguished the Ravenscroft case from previous grimoire encounters was the extensive documentation of the family's gradual descent into supernatural horror. Unlike medieval monks who might have had limited literacy, or Renaissance scholars who might have been reluctant to admit their involvement with forbidden knowledge, the Victorian Ravenscroft family maintained detailed journals, correspondence, and even photographic records that provide unprecedented insight into the grimoire's methods of psychological manipulation and reality distortion. Lord Edmund's initial approach to the mysterious book reflected typical Victorian scholarly methodology. He attempted to classify its language and script, documented its unusual physical properties, and consulted with colleagues at various universities regarding its possible origins. His early journal entries showed genuine excitement at having discovered what he believed to be a previously unknown ancient text that might contribute to contemporary understanding of classical civilization. However, unlike previous scholars who had encountered the grimoire, Lord Edmund wasn't working alone. His wife, Lady Catherine Ravenscroft, was herself an accomplished researcher who had published several papers on ancient languages and religious practices. Their 3 children, Thomas, age 12, Margaret, age 10, and young William, age 8, were all precocious and intellectually curious, having been raised in an environment that valued learning and investigation above all else. This family dynamic would prove crucial to understanding how the grimoire operated when multiple intelligent individuals were exposed to its influence simultaneously, rather than focusing its attention on a single victim. The book seemed to adapt its approach to affect each family member in ways that were specifically tailored to their individual personalities and intellectual capabilities. Lord Edmund found that the grimoire's text addressed his specific research interests in classical history and comparative religion. Passages appeared that seemed to offer new insights into ancient civilizations, providing detailed information about historical periods that conventional scholarship had only fragmentary knowledge of. Lady Catherine discovered sections that dealt with linguistic evolution and the development of writing systems, presenting theories that were decades ahead of contemporary academic thinking. Most disturbing, the children began to find portions of the text that seemed designed specifically for young minds. Thomas discovered mathematical principles that wouldn't be formally developed until the 20th century, presented in a form that was somehow perfectly comprehensible to a 12-year-old. Margaret found stories and mythological narratives that were simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling, featuring characters and plot structures that seemed to operate by dream logic rather than conventional storytelling. Even young William, barely literate, began drawing complex geometric patterns that perfectly matched symbols found in the grimoire's margins. The family's shared study sessions, initially delightful gatherings where they would discuss their individual discoveries and attempt to piece together the grimoire's overall structure and purpose, gradually became exercises in collective psychological deterioration. Each family member began to experience changes that reflected their particular engagement with the book's contents. Lord Edmund developed an obsession with historical accuracy that led him to question established facts about ancient civilizations. He began to insist that conventional chronologies were wrong, that certain historical events had occurred in different orders than previously believed, and that evidence existed for advanced ancient technologies that mainstream archaeology refused to acknowledge. His correspondence with academic colleagues became increasingly erratic, filled with claims that couldn't be substantiated and theories that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Lady Catherine's linguistic research became similarly distorted. She began to claim that she had discovered evidence for a proto-language that predated all known language families and that seemed to possess inherent magical properties. Her attempts to reconstruct this ancient tongue led her to speak in ways that hurt to listen to, words that seemed to carry too much meaning, sentences that conveyed ideas that listeners were certain they had never learned, and pronunciation patterns that seemed to resonate in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. The children's changes were perhaps most disturbing because they seemed so innocuous initially. Thomas's advanced mathematical abilities were dismissed as precocious talent until his teachers realized that he was solving problems using methods that hadn't been invented yet. Margaret's storytelling became increasingly elaborate and creative, but her tales invariably featured elements that gave listeners nightmares, characters who lived in impossible places, events that occurred outside normal time, and endings that suggested realities where conventional morality and logic held no meaning. Young William, too young to engage with the grimoire's text directly, nonetheless began to display abilities that shouldn't have been possible for a child his age. He would create artwork that depicted locations and creatures that he claimed to see in the spaces between the walls, and would speak casually about conversations with the tall friends who visited him during the night. The supernatural phenomena affecting Ravenscroft Manor escalated gradually but inexorably throughout 1872. The family's extensive photographic collection from this period, one of the first documented cases where supernatural phenomena were captured. Using the newly developed photographic technique shows evidence of reality distortion that becomes increasingly severe over time. Early photographs from the summer of 1872 show subtle anomalies, shadows that fall in wrong directions, reflections in mirrors that don't quite match the rooms they're supposed to depict, and occasional blurred figures in the backgrounds that family members couldn't recall being present when the photographs were taken. By autumn, the photographic evidence becomes much more dramatic: rooms that appear larger in the photographs than their actual dimensions, furniture arrangements that change between exposures taken minutes apart, and clear images of additional family members who are dressed in archaic clothing and whose faces don't match any known relatives. The most unsettling photographs, taken during the winter of 1872, show the family engaged in activities that they had no memory of performing. These images depict elaborate ritual arrangements with the family members positioned in complex geometric patterns, surrounded by objects that don't appear in any estate inventory. Most disturbing, these photographs show the family's eyes reflecting light in ways that suggest the presence of additional intelligences looking out through their normal human consciousness. The family's descent into supernatural horror accelerated dramatically as winter approached. The manor staff began to experience psychological disturbances that mirrored, in diluted form, the changes affecting the Ravenscroft family themselves. Servants reported shared dreams featuring the same tall, robed figures that young William claimed to see during his waking hours. The estate's grounds began to display botanical anomalies: plants that grew in impossible geometric patterns, flowers that bloomed in colors that didn't exist in normal spectrums, and trees that cast shadows that seemed to move independently of wind or sun position. The manor's architecture itself began to exhibit properties that defied rational explanation. Rooms would be found with different dimensions than they had possessed the day before. Hallways would lead to destinations that changed based on the time of day or the identity of the person walking them. Most disturbing, new rooms began to appear: chambers that couldn't possibly fit within the manor's external structure but that contained furniture, artwork, and books that seemed to have been designed for the specific use of the Raven family. The climax of the Ravenscroft tragedy occurred during the winter solstice of 1872, though the exact details remain controversial due to the contradictory nature of the surviving evidence. Multiple independent accounts exist from surviving servants, investigating police officers, and neighbors who witnessed events from a distance, but these accounts describe phenomena so far outside normal experience that establishing a coherent narrative remains challenging. What all witnesses agree upon is that the night of December 21, 1872, was accompanied by supernatural phenomena that affected not just Ravenscroft Manor, but the entire surrounding countryside. Residents of the nearby village reported seeing lights in impossible colors emanating from the manor, hearing sounds that resembled vast machinery operating beneath the earth, and experiencing shared dreams that featured geometric structures that hurt to remember clearly. The Ravenscroft family was discovered the following morning by the local constabulary, who had been summoned by servants who had fled the manor during the night. The scene they found defied both explanation and, in many ways, detailed description. The family had been arranged in the manor's main hall in a perfect pentagram formation, but their positioning suggested that they had been aware and cooperative participants in whatever ritual had taken place, rather than unwilling victims. Most unsettling, the family members appeared to have aged at different rates during the final night. Lord Edmund appeared to have aged decades, his hair completely white and his face bearing lines that suggested a lifetime of exposure to knowledge that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. Lady Catherine appeared younger than she had in years, but her eyes reflected an intelligence that seemed distinctly non-human. The children showed the most dramatic changes. Damas appeared to have aged into early adulthood overnight, while Margaret and William seemed to have become something that was still recognizably human but possessed additional physical characteristics that investigating officers were reluctant to describe in their official reports. The grimoire itself was found at the center of the pentagram formation, open 2 pages that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. Attempts to photograph these pages resulted in images that showed different texts each time they were developed, and several of the investigating officers reported experiencing severe psychological disturbances after viewing the book's contents. Perhaps most disturbing, the Ravenscroft family members were technically still alive when discovered, though their consciousness appeared to have been fundamentally altered. They spoke in languages that combined recognizable English with sounds that seemed to predate human vocal development. They demonstrated knowledge of events that hadn't yet occurred, and displayed abilities that suggested access to information sources that existed outside normal space and time. The family was taken into custody by authorities who were unsure how to classify their condition. They were clearly no longer entirely human, but they showed no signs of disease or injury that could explain their transformation. Within a week of their discovery, all 4 family members had died, apparently of natural causes, though their bodies displayed characteristics that forensic investigators couldn't explain, and were reluctant to document officially. The Ravens manor itself was sealed by government authorities and remained unoccupied for decades afterward. The grimoire disappeared during the investigation, though several officers reported that it seemed to vanish and reappear at will during the brief period it remained in official custody. The manor's extensive library was dispersed at auction, but many of the volumes showed signs of contamination similar to what had been observed in previous locations where the grimoire had appeared. Additional text that appeared overnight, marginalia in unknown scripts, and content that seemed to change based on who was reading it. The Ravenscroft case marked a turning point in official attitudes towards supernatural phenomena. Unlike previous incidents that could be dismissed as medieval superstition or religious hysteria, the Ravenscroft tragedy occurred in the modern era, with extensive documentation and multiple independent witnesses. Government and academic authorities could no longer ignore the evidence that certain artifacts possessed abilities that superseded known physical and psychological laws. However, rather than leading to increased public awareness of supernatural threats, the Ravenscroft case resulted in the establishment of official policies designed to suppress information about such phenomena. Secret departments were created within various government agencies, specifically tasked with investigating and containing supernatural threats while preventing public knowledge of their existence. These policies would remain in effect well into the modern era, contributing to the grimoire's ability to continue its work, largely undetected by mainstream society. The early 20th century marked a period of unprecedented global upheaval, with 2 world wars, massive technological advancement, and social transformation on a scale never before witnessed in human history. Against this backdrop of chaos and change, the Saint Cyprian grimoire adapted its methods to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of the modern errata, hubris of scientific rationalism, the breakdown of traditional religious authority, and the emergence of individuals who possessed both advanced education and access to resources that previous generations could never have imagined. The grimoire's most significant 20th century appearance began in 1910, when reports reached the newly formed Societas Hermetica Internationalis, secret organization of wealthy occultists and scholars, that the cursed tome had been located in the ruins of an abandoned Orthodox monastery deep in the Carpathian Mountains of Transylvania. The monastery, known as Monasteria Umbrillar, the Monastery of Shadows, had been destroyed during Ottoman invasions in the 16th century, and left to decay for over 300 years. The man who would lead the expedition to recover the group was Horace Vane, arguably one of the most dangerous and accomplished occultists of his generation. Unlike the monks and scholars who had previously encountered the book, Vane approached the grimoire with both extensive preparation and a profound understanding of the supernatural forces he was attempting to engage. He had spent decades studying accounts of previous grimoire encounters, had developed what he believed to be effective protective techniques, and had assembled a team of 12 highly trained associates who shared his confidence that the book's power could be harnessed safely. Vane's background made him seem like the ideal candidate to succeed where others had failed. Born into a wealthy American industrialist family, he had received the finest education available, earning degrees from Harvard, Oxford, and the Sorbonne. He spoke 9 languages fluently, had traveled extensively throughout Asia and the Middle East, studying various mystical traditions, and had written several scholarly works on comparative religion that were respected by academic authorities. Most importantly, he had successfully conducted numerous expeditions to recover dangerous occult artifacts, always managing to study them safely and return them to secure storage without suffering the fate that had befallen previous researchers. Vane's expedition team represented the cutting edge of early 20th century occult research. His associates included Dr. Elena Vasquez, a Spanish anthropologist who specialized in pre-Christian European religious practices, Professor Chen Weiming, a Chinese scholar of Taoist alchemy and immortality techniques, Captain James Sinclair, a former British military officer who had developed expertise in protective ritual magic during colonial service in India, and 9 other individuals who each brought specialized knowledge and abilities to the enterprise. The team's preparation for the expedition was extraordinarily thorough. They spent 6 months in advanced study, researching every available account of previous grimoire encounters, and developing comprehensive protective protocols. Each team member underwent extensive training in mental fortification techniques drawn from various mystical traditions. They prepared detailed contingency plans for different types of supernatural phenomena and equipped themselves with protective amulets, blessed weapons, and scientific instruments designed to detect and measure supernatural energy. Most significantly, Vane had developed what he believed to be a revolutionary approach to engaging with dangerous occult materials. Rather than attempting to study the grimoire directly, his plan was to create a specially designed containment chamber, where the book could be isolated from direct human contact while still allowing for observation and limited interaction. This chamber, constructed according to principles derived from ancient Persian and Egyptian protective magic, was transported to the monastery site in pieces and assembled on location. The expedition's journey to the Carpathian Mountains in the autumn of 1910 was itself fraught with ominous signs. Local villagers, when they learned of the team's destination, refused to provide assistance and begged them to abandon their mission. Romanian Orthodox priests attempted to perform protective blessings on the expedition members, but several reported that their prayers seemed to slip away during the ceremonies, as if some force was actively interfering with divine protection. The landscape around the ruined monastery displayed characteristics that defied rational explanation. Despite the approach of winter, vegetation near the ruins showed signs of unnatural growth, trees that had grown in impossible directions, plants that displayed flower and fruit simultaneously, and moss formations that seemed to form complex geometric patterns when viewed from certain angles. The local wildlife exhibited highly unusual behavior, with birds flying in geometric formations that resembled mathematical diagrams and forest animals gathering in groups to observe the expedition from safe distances. The monastery ruins themselves were far more extensive than historical records suggested they should have been. Archaeological evidence indicated that the original structure had been built and rebuilt multiple times over centuries, with each iteration incorporating architectural elements from different periods and cultures. Most puzzling, some sections of the ruins appeared to be in much better condition than they should have been after centuries of abandonment, while others showed signs of destruction that seemed to have occurred far more recently than the documented Ottoman attacks. Vane's team established their base camp in what had once been the monastery's main courtyard, and began the careful process of exploring the underground chambers where local legends claimed the grimoire was hidden. Their scientific instruments immediately detected energy readings that didn't correspond to any known physical phenomena, electromagnetic fluctuations that seemed to follow mathematical patterns, temperature variations that created impossible thermal gradients, and gravitational anomalies that suggested the presence of mass that couldn't be visually detected. The underground chamber system proved to be far more complex than anticipated. Passages led to rooms that seemed to connect to other passages in ways that violated basic principles of geometry. The team's mapping attempts produced diagrams that appeared to be accurate when drawn, but couldn't possibly represent the three-dimensional space they had actually explored. Most disturbing, several team members reported encountering rooms that contained modern technological equipment that couldn't possibly have existed when the monastery was abandoned. Electric lighting systems, mechanical devices whose purpose couldn't be determined, and instruments that seemed designed for scientific observations but operated according to principles that no team member could understand. The grimoire itself was discovered in a chamber that defied both architectural, logic, and physical law. The chamber appeared to be perfectly spherical from the inside, despite being accessed through rectangular doorways. Its walls were covered with inscriptions in dozens of languages, including several that none of the team members could identify despite their collective linguistic expertise. Mathematical formulas appeared alongside religious texts, astronomical diagrams were interwoven with musical notation, and geometric patterns seemed to shift and change when observed directly. At the center of the chamber, the grimoire rested on a pedestal that appeared to be carved from a single piece of black stone, though the stone's surface reflected light in ways that suggested it might not be entirely solid. The book itself seemed larger and more complex than descriptions from previous encounters suggested, not just a single volume, but a collection of texts that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Vane's team approached the grimoire with extreme caution, using their specially designed containment protocols to avoid direct contact while still allowing for detailed observation. Their scientific instruments detected energy patterns emanating from the book that suggested it was actively manipulating local space-time in ways that shouldn't have been physically possible. Photographic attempts produced images that showed different content each time they were developed, and several team members reported that the book's text seemed to be responding to their thoughts and questions in real time. The team's plan called for a gradual, systematic study of the grimoire over a period of several weeks, with each team member specializing in different aspects of the book's content and properties. This methodical approach initially seemed to be successful. The protective protocols appeared to be working. Team members showed no signs of the psychological deterioration that had affected previous researchers, and they began to gather unprecedented data about the grimoire's abilities and origins. However, Vane's confidence in his protective measures proved to be tragically misplaced. The grimoire's influence on the expedition team was subtle but inexorable, working through methods that bypassed their conscious awareness and defensive preparations. Rather than attempting to corrupt individual team members directly, the book seemed to be manipulating the group dynamics and environmental conditions in ways that gradually undermined their collective ability to resist its influence. The first signs of trouble appeared after approximately 2 weeks of study. Team members began to report unusually vivid dreams that featured the same themes and imagery: vast underground cities, impossible architectural structures, and encounters with tall, robed figures who spoke in languages that hurt to remember upon waking. These shared dreams gradually became more detailed and emotionally intense, with team members finding themselves looking forward to sleep as an opportunity to continue conversations and explorations that seemed more real and meaningful than their waking activities simultaneously. The team's research began to produce results that were far more dramatic and significant than anyone had anticipated. The grimoire appeared to contain information that could revolutionize human understanding of mathematics, physics, and cosmology. Dr. Vasquez discovered anthropological data that suggested human civilization was far older and more advanced than conventional archaeology acknowledged. Professor Chen found alchemical formulas that seemed to demonstrate the possibility of genuine material transmutation. Captain Sinclair uncovered military strategies and weapons, technologies that were centuries ahead of contemporary developments. Each team member became increasingly obsessed with their individual research, spending longer hours in study and becoming less communicative with their colleagues. The protective protocols that had initially seemed so important were gradually abandoned as team members convinced themselves that their research was too valuable to be constrained by excessive caution. The containment chamber designed to isolate the grimoire was open for longer periods, with team members arguing that direct contact was necessary for proper scholarly investigation. The psychological changes affecting the expedition team accelerated rapidly during the final week of their stay at the monastery. Team members began to display enhanced intellectual capabilities that seemed to come at the cost of their emotional and social connections. Their conversations became increasingly technical and philosophical, filled with concepts and terminology that outside observers found difficult to follow. More disturbing, they began to demonstrate knowledge of information that they shouldn't have had access to, details about each other's personal histories, insights into scientific problems that weren't related to their research, an apparent awareness of events that were occurring in distant locations. The climax of the expedition occurred during the winter solstice of 1910. Vane's final journal entry, written in a mixture of English and symbolic notation that defied translation, describes a convergence of possibilities and a revelation of the underlying structure that supports all apparent realities. What exactly happened during the final night remains unclear, as no external witnesses survived to provide testimony. What is known is that Romanian authorities, responding to reports of strange lights and sounds emanating from the monastery ruins, discovered the expedition's camp in a state that defied rational explanation. The containment chamber had been completely destroyed, apparently from the inside, with metal components twisted into geometric shapes that shouldn't have been achievable through any known physical force. The team's scientific equipment had been arranged in complex patterns throughout the chamber, where the grimoire had been housed, forming what appeared to be some kind of massive ritual diagram. Of the 13 expedition members, only Horace Vane was found alive, though his condition was such that authorities initially thought he was dead. He was discovered in a catatonic state in the center of the underground chamber, surrounded by the bodies of his 12 associates. The other team members had died without any apparent cause, no injuries, no signs of disease, no evidence of violence or poisoning. Their faces bore expressions that investigating officers found deeply disturbing, looks of absolute terror combined with what appeared to be profound understanding or revelation. Vane himself never fully recovered from his experience with the grimoire. He was transported to a private medical facility in Vienna, where he remained for the final 37 years of his life in a state that physicians found impossible to classify. He was physically healthy and occasionally responsive, but seemed to exist in a reality that bore little resemblance to the normal world. He spent his time creating detailed drawings and mathematical notations that specialists couldn't interpret, speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, and writing extensive texts that appeared to deal with scientific and philosophical concepts that wouldn't be developed by mainstream academia for decades. Perhaps most unsettling, Vane demonstrated abilities that suggested his encounter with the grimoire had fundamentally altered his relationship with normal space and time. He would accurately predict future events, display knowledge of scientific discoveries that hadn't yet been made, and occasionally refer to conversations with his deceased expedition members as if they were still present. Medical professionals who worked with him reported experiencing unusual psychological effects, vivid dreams, enhanced intellectual capabilities, and disturbing insights into the nature of reality that they found difficult to dismiss as mere imagination. The grimoire itself vanished from the monastery ruins, though its influence on the surrounding area continued for decades afterward. The Romanian government classified the region as a restricted zone and prevented public access, but reports continued to surface of supernatural phenomena affecting anyone who ventured too close to the monastery site. Local wildlife displayed increasingly abnormal behavior, plants grew in patterns that resembled mathematical diagrams, and several investigative teams sent to study the area experienced psychological disturbances similar to those that had affected Vane's expedition. The failure of Vane's carefully planned and extensively prepared expedition marked a turning point in official attitudes toward the group. Previous encounters had involved individuals who might have been considered naive or inadequately prepared, but Vane and his team represented the pinnacle of early 20th century occult scholarship. Their defeat demonstrated that the Grimm power operated on levels that superseded human understanding, regardless of preparation or expertise. In response to the Transylvanian disaster, several government and religious organizations began to develop new strategies for dealing with supernatural threats that acknowledged the inadequacy of conventional protective measures. The Vatican established a Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology, with a secret mandate to investigate and contain dangerous artifacts. The British government created the Department of Unconventional Warfare within military intelligence. Even the emerging Soviet Union, despite its official atheism, quietly established research divisions dedicated to studying paranormal phenomena that might have military applications. These organizations shared information about the grimoire and began to develop coordinated strategies for tracking its movements and preventing future tragedies. However, their efforts were hampered by the book's apparent ability to remain hidden for extended periods and its talent for appearing in locations and circumstances that made conventional containment impossible. The grimoire's next major appearance occurred during the chaos of World War I, when reports surfaced that German occult researchers had acquired the book and were attempting to weaponize its power for military purposes. These reports, if accurate, would explain some of the more inexplicable battlefield phenomena reported during the war, entire units disappearing without trace, weapons that seemed to operate by unknown principles, and strategic decisions that appeared to be based on impossible foreknowledge of enemy movements. However, verification of these reports proved impossible, as most of the German occult research facilities were destroyed during the final months of the war, apparently by their own personnel. The few surviving documents that Allied investigators managed to recover were written in symbolic notation that defied translation and contained references to experimental results that seemed to violate known physical laws. The interwar period saw increased cooperation between various national agencies tasked with supernatural threat assessment. By the 1920s, an informal international network had developed that shared information about dangerous artifacts and coordinated responses to supernatural incidents that crossed national boundaries. This network, which operated through diplomatic channels and maintained absolute secrecy, represented humanity's most sophisticated attempt to develop systematic defenses against forces that operated beyond normal understanding. It was through this network that information reached Romanian authorities about a group of Orthodox priests who had developed what they believed to be a definitive solution to the grimoire problem. Father Michael Constanța, a Romanian monk who had spent decades studying historical accounts of grimoire encounters, had concluded that previous containment attempts had failed because they relied on human-designed protective measures that could be circumvented by an intelligence that operated by non-human logic. Father Constanța's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to understand or control the grimoire's power, he proposed to remove it entirely from human reach by depositing it in the deepest accessible part of the ocean, where crushing pressure and eternal darkness might succeed, where fire, blessed barriers, and protective rituals had failed. The physical isolation wouldn't necessarily destroy the book, but it would prevent it from finding new human victims and might force it into a state of dormancy that could last for centuries or millennia. The implementation of Father Constanța's plan required extensive international cooperation and resources that could only be provided through the secret supernatural threat network. The operation, designated Deep Anchor in classified documents, involved representatives from Romanian Orthodox authorities, Vatican specialists in dangerous artifacts, British naval resources, and Soviet deep-sea technology that was supposedly still in experimental stages. The grimoire was located in 1951 at a private estate in the Carpathian Mountains, where it had been in the possession of a wealthy collector, who had died under circumstances that local authorities refused to investigate. The book's retrieval was conducted by a joint team that included Father Constanța, 2 Vatican exorcists, a British Royal Navy deep-sea specialist, and several Romanian military personnel who had been specially selected for psychological stability and resistance to supernatural influence. The retrieval operation itself demonstrated that even brief contact with the grimoire could produce profound effects. Team members reported that the book seemed to resist their efforts to secure it, becoming heavier when they attempted to move it and exhibiting temperature fluctuations that ranged from burning hot to freezing cold within seconds. The lead-line containment box that had been specially constructed for the operation showed signs of internal pressure that shouldn't have been possible from a book, and several team members reported hearing voices that seemed to come from within the sealed container. Transportation of the secured grimoire to the Black Sea required a carefully planned route that avoided populated areas and incorporated multiple protective protocols. The convoy included Orthodox priests who maintained continuous prayers, Vatican representatives who carried blessed relics, and scientific personnel who monitored the containment box for any signs that the book's influence might be extending beyond its physical boundaries. Even during transportation, supernatural phenomena affected the convoy's progress. Electronic equipment malfunctioned without apparent cause. Compasses pointed in directions that didn't correspond to magnetic north, and several vehicles experienced mechanical failures that repair specialists couldn't explain. Most disturbing, convoy personnel reported shared dreams during rest stop streams that featured the same tall, robed figures that had appeared in previous grimoire encounters, but now apparently attempting to communicate warnings about the consequences of the planned disposal. The disposal operation took place on October 31, 1952, at coordinates in the Black Sea that represented the deepest accessible point within Romanian territorial waters. The operation was conducted from a specially modified fishing vessel that had been equipped with deep-sea disposal equipment borrowed from Soviet naval research programs. Father Constanza personally oversaw the final blessing ritual, which incorporated protective elements from multiple religious traditions and included prayers in languages that some participants couldn't identify but somehow understood. The grimoire, still sealed in its Aloud-lined container, was attached to chains that had been forged from iron blessed by representatives of 7 different Christian denominations. Additional weights were added to ensure that the container would sink quickly to the maximum depth and remain there regardless of any supernatural forces that might attempt to retrieve it. The final container assembly weighed over 200 pounds and was designed to withstand the crushing pressure at depth while preventing any possibility of accidental recovery. The disposal itself was accompanied by phenomena that convinced even the most skeptical participants that they were dealing with forces beyond normal understanding. As the container was lowered into the water, the sea around the disposal site became completely calm despite rough weather conditions elsewhere. Marine life in the immediate area displayed highly unusual behavior, with fish swimming in geometric patterns and dolphins appearing to form complex formations that resembled mathematical diagrams. Most unsettling, several participants reported seeing additional figures on the vessel during the disposal ceremony, individuals in flowing robes who seemed to be observing the proceedings with expressions of vast, alien amusement. These figures appeared in peripheral vision but vanished when observed directly, leading some participants to dismiss them as stress-induced hallucinations. However, photographs taken during the ceremony later revealed clearly visible additional individuals who none of the participants could identify. As the container disappeared into the Black Sea's depths, participants reported a collective sense of relief that was so profound it seemed almost supernatural in itself. The oppressive psychological pressure that had affected everyone involved in the operation since its beginning suddenly lifted, and several team members described feeling as if they could think clearly for the first time in months. The disposal operation was deemed successful by all participating organizations. Follow-up monitoring of the disposal site showed no unusual activity, and the various supernatural threat assessment networks reported a significant decrease in grimoire-related incidents worldwide. For nearly 7 decades, it appeared that Father Constance's simple but effective solution had finally neutralized one of humanity's most persistent supernatural threats. However, this apparent success would prove to be temporary, as events in the 21st century would demonstrate that the grimoire's power extended far beyond the physical constraints that human understanding could encompass. The turn of the 21st century brought with it technological capabilities that previous generations could never have imagined. Satellite navigation systems could pinpoint locations with centimeter accuracy, deep-sea exploration vehicles could reach the most remote corners of the ocean floor, and global communication networks allowed instantaneous coordination of research efforts across continents. It was this combination of advanced technology and international cooperation that would lead to one of the most disturbing discoveries in the history of supernatural research. Nikolai Gregorov, grandson of Captain Anatoly Gregorov, who had participated in the 1952 disposal operation, had grown up with intimate knowledge of his family's role in containing the Saint Cyprian. Unlike his grandfather, who had been a simple fishing vessel captain hired for his discretion and seamanship, Nikolai represented the new generation of supernatural investigators, university-educated, technologically sophisticated, and equipped with resources that the original disposal team could never have accessed. By 2023, Nikolai had established himself as one of Europe's leading marine archaeologists, specializing in the recovery and analysis of underwater historical sites. His legitimate academic work provided perfect cover for his true obsession, using modern technology to verify that the grimoire remained safely contained in the depths of the Black Sea. What had begun as a desire to honor his grandfather's legacy had gradually evolved into a comprehensive investigation that would challenge everything the supernatural research community believed about the nature of the threat they were dealing with. Nikolai's expedition, officially designated as a study of Black Sea oceanographic conditions but actually focused on locating and examining the grimoire's disposal site, represented the most technologically advanced supernatural investigation ever attempted. His team included marine biologists, deep-sea exploration specialists, underwater archaeologists, and operating under cover of academic credentials, several individuals with extensive experience in paranormal research and supernatural threat assessment. The expedition vessel, the Marian Grok, was equipped with the latest in underwater exploration technology, autonomous underwater vehicles capable of operating at crushing depths, sonar systems that could map underwater terrain with unprecedented accuracy, and robotic manipulation systems that could retrieve objects from the seafloor without requiring human contact. Most importantly for the mission's true purpose, the vessel carried detection equipment specifically designed to identify supernatural energy signatures, based on decades of research into the environmental effects produced by dangerous artifacts. The initial phase of the expedition focused on precisely locating the disposal site, using GPS coordinates derived from newly declassified Romanian naval archives. This proved more challenging than anticipated, as the disposal coordinates recorded in 1952 didn't correspond exactly to any identifiable underwater landmarks. The seafloor in the target area showed signs of geological activity that shouldn't have occurred in the relatively stable Black Sea environment. Underwater formations that appeared to have been created by forces other than normal sedimentation and erosion. When the disposal site was finally located, the expedition team's instruments detected energy readings that immediately raised concerns about the effectiveness of the original containment. The water around the disposal coordinates showed temperature and chemical anomalies that suggested ongoing activity at depth. Marine life in the immediate area displayed behavioral patterns that marine biologists couldn't explain: fish swimming in geometric formations, unusual bioluminescent displays that seemed to follow mathematical patterns, and the presence of species that shouldn't have existed at such depths. Most unsettling, the underwater vehicle's cameras captured images of the seafloor that seemed to change between observation sessions. Terrain features would appear in different locations. Rock formations would show signs of recent arrangement despite being covered by decades of sediment. And occasionally the cameras would detect movement that suggested the presence of large organisms that never appeared clearly enough to be properly identified. The grimoire's containment box was located after 3 weeks of intensive searching, but its condition immediately raised alarming questions about the disposal operation's long-term effectiveness. The lead-lined container remained intact and properly sealed, exactly where the disposal records indicated it should be. However, the chains that had been used to secure it showed signs of stress and manipulation that couldn't be explained by natural underwater conditions. More disturbing, the seafloor around the container had been arranged in complex geometric patterns that suggested intelligent intervention. The decision to retrieve the container was made after extensive consultation with supernatural threat assessment networks worldwide. While the risks of bringing the grimoire back to the surface were acknowledged, the evidence suggested that the containment was already compromised and that leaving it in place might not provide continued protection. The retrieval operation was planned with the same attention to protective protocols that had characterized the original disposal. With additional precautions based on 70 years of advances in supernatural threat management, the container was brought to the surface using remote manipulation systems that prevented any human from coming into direct contact with it. Even these precautions proved inadequate, as the retrieval operation was accompanied by phenomena that affected not just the expedition team but electronic equipment and marine life throughout the area. Navigation systems malfunctioned in ways that suggested deliberate interference. Communication equipment picked up signals that contained information no one had transmitted, and several team members reported experiencing shared visions that featured locations and events they had never encountered. The moment of truth came when the container was opened in a specially constructed isolation chamber aboard the Marian. The chamber had been designed according to the most advanced supernatural containment principles, incorporating protective elements from multiple religious traditions, scientific shielding based on electromagnetic field manipulation, and monitoring equipment that could detect and record any unusual phenomena. What the team discovered inside the container defied every assumption about the nature of the threat they were dealing with. The grimoire was gone, not destroyed, not displaced, but simply absent, leaving behind a lead-lined box that showed no signs of having been opened or breached since 1952. The blessed chains remained intact, the protective seals were undamaged, and there was no evidence that anything had ever been stored inside the container. This discovery forced a fundamental reevaluation of everything that was believed about the grimoire's nature and capabilities. Either the book had never been successfully contained in the first place, suggesting that the disposal operation had been manipulated by forces beyond human understanding, or it possessed abilities that allowed it to escape physical constraints. Without leaving any evidence of its methods, the implications became even more disturbing. When Nikolai's team began to investigate reports of grimoire-related incidents that had occurred during the supposedly successful containment period, a comprehensive review of supernatural threat assessment records revealed that activities consistent with grimoire influence had continued throughout the decades. When the book was believed to be safely contained beneath the Black Sea, these incidents had been scattered across different countries and investigated by different agencies, preventing anyone from recognizing the pattern until Nikolai's team conducted the first comprehensive analysis. The evidence suggested that the grimoire had not only escaped containment but had evolved new methods of operation that were adapted to the modern era. Rather than appearing as a single physical artifact that could be tracked and contained, the book seemed to have developed the ability to manifest simultaneously in multiple locations, often in forms that were adapted to contemporary technology and communication methods. Reports began to surface from around the world of individuals discovering what appeared to be the Saint Cyprian grimoire in impossible circumstances. A computer programmer in Tokyo found the book's complete text on his hard drive, despite having no memory of downloading it and no record of the file's origin. A university student in Berlin discovered a perfectly preserved medieval manuscript in her dormitory room, though security records showed no one had entered or left the building. A retired professor in São Paulo received an email attachment that, when opened, materialized as a physical book that appeared on his desk while his computer displayed only an error message. Each of these incidents followed the familiar pattern of grimoire encounters: initial curiosity leading to obsessive study, rapid intellectual enhancement accompanied by psychological deterioration, and ultimately disappearance or death under circumstances that defied rational explanation. However, the modern incidents showed evidence of adaptation and evolution that made them far more dangerous than historical encounters. The grimoire's digital manifestations proved particularly insidious. Unlike physical books that could be recognized as dangerous artifacts, digital versions appeared as ordinary computer files that could be easily copied, shared, and distributed without the recipients being aware of their true nature. Social media platforms began reporting unusual phenomena: users sharing posts that contained text in unknown scripts, viral videos that featured mathematical formulas that hurt to analyze, and discussion threads that seemed to develop their own intelligence and began responding to comments in ways that suggested non-human consciousness. Perhaps most disturbing, the grimoire's modern manifestations seemed to be working towards some kind of convergence event. Analysis of the various incidents revealed patterns that suggested coordination between different manifestations. People affected by the digital versions were having shared experiences. Individuals in different countries were reporting identical visions, and the mathematical formulas appearing in various formats seemed to be components of a larger equation that was being assembled piece by piece across multiple locations. Government, agencies, and religious organizations that had been tasked with supernatural threat assessment found themselves facing a challenge that exceeded their capabilities. Traditional containment methods were useless against a threat that could manifest digitally and spread through global communication networks. Protective rituals and blessed barriers had no effect on computer files. Even the complete destruction of affected electronic devices proved ineffective, as the grimoire's digital manifestations seemed capable of recreating themselves from backup files, cached data, and even corrupted memory fragments. The situation became critical in late 2024, when multiple supernatural threat assessment networks reported coordinated grimoire activities occurring simultaneously across 6 continents. The digital manifestations had apparently reached some kind of critical mass that allowed them to begin affecting physical reality directly. Cities around the world reported unexplained atmospheric phenomena. Electronic infrastructure began experiencing systematic failures that followed mathematical patterns, and increasing numbers of people began displaying the enhanced intellectual capabilities and psychological deterioration characteristic of grimoire exposure. Emergency conferences were convened by government agencies, religious authorities, and academic institutions that had been monitoring supernatural threats. For the first time in history, the existence of the grimoire and the threat it represented became known to senior political and military leaders, who had previously been excluded from supernatural threat briefings. The revelation that humanity had been dealing with a persistent supernatural threat for over 17 centuries, and that this threat had now evolved beyond traditional containment methods, provoked responses ranging from denial to panic. The international response to the grimoire crisis represented an unprecedented level of cooperation between institutions that had historically operated in secrecy and isolation. The Vatican opened its secret archives to secular researchers. Government agencies shared classified supernatural research with academic institutions, and military organizations began developing contingency plans for scenarios that their personnel had never been trained to handle. However, these efforts were hampered by a fundamental problem. No one understood exactly what the grimoire was trying to achieve. The evidence suggested that it was working towards some kind of culminating event that would occur when sufficient numbers of people had been exposed to its influence. but the nature of this event remained unclear. Some researchers theorized that the grimoire was attempting to prepare humanity for contact with the alien intelligences that had originally created it. Others believed that it was systematically corrupting human knowledge to make civilization more vulnerable to conquest or manipulation. The most pessimistic assessments suggested that the grimoire was working toward the complete replacement of human consciousness with something that better served the purposes of its original creators. As 2025 progressed, the urgency of the situation became impossible to ignore. The grimoire's influence was spreading exponentially through digital networks, affecting millions of people who had no idea they were being exposed to a supernatural threat. Traditional protective measures proved useless against an enemy that could manifest through any electronic device connected to global communication networks. Even more alarming, the people being affected by the grimoire's digital manifestations were predominantly young, educated, and technologically sophisticated, exactly the demographic that would be most crucial for humanity's future development. Current estimates suggest that the grimoire in its various manifestations has now been encountered by more people than in all of its previous centuries of activity combined. Each new person exposed to its influence becomes a potential vector for further contamination, creating a cascade effect that threatens to reach every corner of human civilization. The protective barriers and containment strategies that had worked against a single physical artifact are useless against a threat that can exist simultaneously in millions of digital locations. Perhaps most disturbing of all, recent analysis suggests that the grimoire's 17th century campaign of corruption and manipulation may be approaching its intended conclusion. The mathematical formulas appearing in digital manifestations, when combined with the geometric patterns reported from physical encounters, appear to form components of a massive calculation that might represent some kind of summoning ritual or dimensional gateway activation. If this analysis is correct, then every historical grimoire encounter from Saint Cyprian's original creation to the modern digital manifestations has been part of a single, coordinated effort to prepare conditions for an event that could fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. As we stand at this crossroads, facing a threat that has evolved beyond our ability to contain or control, one question remains: is it already too late to prevent whatever culmination the grimoire has been working toward for over 17 centuries? The answer to that question may determine not just the future of human civilization, but the very nature of reality itself. As we reach the end of this investigation into one of history's most persistent and terrifying supernatural threats, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the courage of everyone who has shared their experiences, researched these phenomena, and worked to protect humanity from forces that operate beyond our understanding. The story of the Saint Cyprian grimoire serves as a reminder that human curiosity, while our greatest strength, can also make us vulnerable to influences that seek to exploit our desire for knowledge and power. Every scholar, monk, and researcher who encountered this cursed tome believed that their intelligence, their faith, or their preparation would protect them from the fate that had befallen their predecessors. In every case, they were wrong. What makes this story particularly relevant to our modern era is the demonstration that supernatural threats can evolve and adapt to new technologies and social conditions. The grimoire that once appeared only as a physical book in monastery libraries has now learned to manifest through digital networks, reaching more people in a single day than it might have encountered in previous centuries. This evolution suggests that other supernatural threats may be similarly adapting to our interconnected world, presenting challenges that our ancestors never had to face. But perhaps the most important lesson from the grimoire's long history is that knowledge of these threats, shared openly and honestly, provides our best defense against them. The secrecy and isolation that characterized previous responses to supernatural phenomena may have been appropriate for earlier eras, but they are inadequate for threats that can spread through global communication networks in minutes. As members of the Sigil Sanctum community, you represent the new generation of individuals who understand that mystery and reality aren't mutually exclusive, that investigating the unknown requires both rational skepticism and openness to possibilities that challenge conventional understanding. Your questions, your research, and your shared experiences contribute to humanity's collective ability to recognize and respond to threats that operate beyond the boundaries of normal experience. Now I want to hear from you. Have you encountered anything in your own experience that defies rational explanation? Have you noticed patterns in seemingly unrelated events that suggest coordination by unseen intelligences? Have you found books, websites, or digital files that seem to contain knowledge that felt dangerous or forbidden? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, but remember that some knowledge comes with risks, and some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. If this investigation has opened your eyes to possibilities you hadn't considered before, make sure you're subscribed to Sigil Sanctum and have notifications enabled. We have more terrifying explorations of history's darkest mysteries coming your way, including next week's deep dive into the Voynich manuscript and its connection to a 15th century alchemist who claimed to have discovered the secret of immortality, a price that may have been too high for humanity to pay. We're also working on a special multi-part series about modern supernatural incidents that suggest ancient threats are adapting to the digital age. The grimoire may be just the beginning of a much larger pattern of supernatural evolution that's occurring right under our noses. Until then, remember, knowledge is power, but wisdom lies in understanding that some knowledge comes with a price that no human should be willing to pay. Stay curious, stay skeptical, but most importantly, stay safe. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of history. This is Sigil Sanctum, where we explore the mysteries that shaped our world and continue to influence our future. The search for truth never ends, but neither does the need for caution. Stay vigilant. The past is never truly buried, and some books are still writing themselves.